Hi, Judy from Bungalow Quilting and Yarn here. Today we're going to talk about how to make these adorable banded skirts. The hardest thing about this skirt is going to be deciding what fabric you're going to use for them because there's so many possibilities. They're made with a main fabric in the center, a band at the bottom, and a casing at the top. You could do 3 different fabrics. You could do, like I've done, 2 different fabrics. The sky's the limit on what you can do with these skirts. And they're so absolutely adorable and simple. Behind me, you can see one of the umbrellas that we've made with our umbrella kits, but that's a topic for another day. So stay tuned, and I hope you're sitting someplace warm. It's -2 outside today in Wisconsin, which is totally child's play. We've had -24, 26. That's not the wind chill. So I'm in here staying nice and warm, and I want to talk to you about how to make these banded skirts. So stay tuned. Okay, so let's talk about some fabric basics. I've got a bolt of fabric here. Like I said, the hardest thing about these skirts is going to be deciding which fabric to use. I'm not using this one because I'm going to make this a skirt for a child, but I just want to talk about a bolt of fabric. So a bolt of fabric comes with the fabric doubled over, and this is going to be a review for most of you watching this, but I just have to tell it for the people who are beginners. When the fabric is rolled onto the bolt, it's doubled. So you've got, 2 layers here like this, and when you open this whole thing out, when you open the entire piece of fabric out, it is 44 inches wide. So if I were to open this whole thing out, it's 44 inches wide. Now one strip of this 44-inch wide fabric would be enough to go easily around a little girl for a skirt. So this is the selvage edge here, and on this side is the selvage edge. So what you're cutting is you're cutting across from here to here, and then your distance from there to there is your yardage. So if you need 1/4 of a yard, you're going to cut 9 inches this direction. And then this distance here to here is going to easily go around any little girl, I would say ages 0 to probably 8 years of age. And that's kind of where we're aiming this skirt pattern. And then if you were doing this for somebody older, you'd need 2 widths of this. So you'd need a strip of this and then another strip of this, and then we join them on the side seams, which would be fun to make these for big girls too. So you're going to wonder, how do we calculate the yardage that we need for these skirts? Well, like I said, we're going to cut across from the selvage to selvage. And that's your distance around your waist, and there's going to be elastic in there. So this is going to be enough to make a nice gathered skirt with a lot of extra room for a little twirling action going on. And we're going to show you exactly how to determine how much fabric you need and how to measure that. Okay, I did not promise you that there would be no math. There will be some math. Okay, so here's my cute little banded skirt. Now at the top of my banded skirt I have a casing, and this casing is 1 inch here. And at the bottom of my cute little skirt I have a band. The band is 2 inches from here to here, okay? Then there's the main fabric, and this is what we have to determine because this is the part that's going to change. This is not the part, this is the variable. That's not the one that is going to stay the same. This stays the same, this stays the same. I have 3/4 inch non-roll elastic, so I want to make sure that my casing is 1 inch because I don't want to try to run a piece of elastic that is too large through a casing. It's impossible. It's too hard to do. And this piece down here, from here to here, is 2 inches. So this is the part that's going to change depending on the size of the child. Remember we said that the fabric was 44 inches across. That's not going to change. So we need to know the distance from there to there and how much fabric to buy. Okay. This piece here, when you make garments, you're going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Back in the old days, the big 3 pattern companies always said 5/8 inch seam allowance. I think a 1/2 inch is fine. When you do quilting, it's 1/4 of an inch for seam allowance, and that's because you're not, the thing is quilted, it's all sewn down. You're not pulling and tugging, you're not going down the slide, you're not going on the swings, so you need a little bit more seam allowance making a garment, okay? You're not stretching your arms, that kind of thing. So it's different for quilting than it is for sewing garments. So I'm just going to say, suffice it to say, 1/2 inch is going to be fine. So if you have a 1/2 inch seam allowance on this piece, times 2, because this is folded over, right? You need an extra 1 inch. All right, so if this is an inch here, the other side is an inch here, and this is a 1/2 inch seam allowance here, times 2, right? This is 1, 2, and then a 1/2 inch seam allowances on both sides is 3 inches. So this band, the casing will be cut 3 inches. And this is all written down here so that you can go back and look over and over again on this. I'm sorry, that was, yeah, 3 inches. So you can go back and look, 3 inches. That's what I said initially. Okay, so you can go back and look at this over and over and over again. Now, this is 2 inches here, 2 inches on this side because this is folded over, it's doubled, and then a 1/2 inch seam allowance there. So that's going to be a 5-inch piece that you're going to have to cut. So when you go to the fabric store, you're going to be buying a 3-inch piece for this. You're going to be buying a 5-inch piece for this. That's 8 inches. You're going to need a 1/4 of a yard for your coordinating band. All right, 1/4 of a yard of fabric. So the distance, now how do you determine then what this piece is going to be here? It depends on the size of the child. So you're going to measure the little girl from the distance from the waistline to the top of the knee. Now when I talk about, I'm going to move this out of the way so this doesn't confuse you for now. When I talk about waistline, I'm talking about your actual waistline. People seem to have a, they don't know where their waistline is nowadays. People don't know what the natural waistline is. The natural waistline should be just about at your belly button. All right, people are wearing low-riding pants, and well, back in the day, you know, we had hip huggers when I was a very, very small child. We had hip huggers that went way, way down below your belly button, but I'm talking about the natural waist. Where is the child going to wear the elastic? At the natural waist. So we're going to measure the distance from the waistline to the top of the knee. So belly button to the top of the knee, okay? Whatever that distance is, let's say it's 12 inches, all right? Then you're going to subtract 1 inch, that's this, for the casing, right? You're going to subtract 2 inches for your lower band, and that's going to give you, because these two numbers are going to stay the same each time, right? Okay, so that's going to tell you how much you need for this piece right here. So if you subtract 1 inch for the casing and 2 inches for the lower band, that tells you the number of inches to cut of the main fabric, right? So you're going to need, well, that's not actually what you're going to cut because you need to add 1 inch in there for seam allowance again. So but that gives you a rough idea of what you're going to need, how long this is going to have to be. All right, so it's 44-inch wide fabric. You're cutting a 3-inch strip for your, don't you love this? A 3-inch strip for your casing, a 5-inch strip for your bottom band. Nobody ever said I was good at math. Okay, so then 2 inches belly button to knee, 12 inches belly button to knee. 1 inch casing, 2 inches bottom band. So you're going, this here would need to be 9 inches, all right? So then you have to allow for your seam allowances, 1/2 inch at the bottom here and 1/2 inch at the top here. So that's 10 inches, right? So you need 10 inches of your main fabric. So this is on a video, that's great. You can go over this and look at it over and over and over again so you don't get it mixed up. If the child's 14 inches from belly button to knee, again, 1 inch casing, 2 inch bottom band, you subtract that from 14, it gives you 11 inches. And then you add 1 inch for the seam allowance with that. You're going to need 12 inches of fabric. So just keep that in mind. And also, if you make a mistake, this is not a big deal. This is not a quilt. The blocks don't have to match up exactly. If your skirt is 1 inch too long, so what? The kid can pull it up higher, cinch it up higher, whatever. If you make a mistake, no big deal. It's going to fit just fine and it's going to look adorable. So don't get totally hung up on these numbers. Now, the other thing that I did with these skirts is I added rickrack around the bottom. And we're going to talk a little bit about adding rickrack trim. It's super cute. Add the rickrack. When you're 40-some years old, you don't wear rickrack anymore. When you're a little kid, you can wear rickrack. So add the rickrack. It just makes things so much more fun, so cute. And we will talk about adding rickrack too. Okay, so now the next thing I have to do is cut. So I cut these. I cut this 3 inches and I cut this 5 inches. And then I cut this whatever measurement was remaining. Okay, and I said the hardest thing was going to be determining what fabric you were going to use. I had it all picked out, what I was going to use, and then I walked in the shop this morning and oh my gosh, this was sitting there and I thought, that's it, I'm using that, and it looks so super cute with this fabric right here. So that's how hard it is to pick out your fabric. So the next thing I did was sew on the rickrack, and the reason I sewed the rickrack on next before cutting these all even was because when you sew trim on anything, whether it's rickrack, whether it's ball fringe, anything, it is going to take up fabric. So what that means is when you sew rickrack on, it's going to shorten this whole piece of fabric. Whenever you sew trim onto fabric, it does have some pull on the back. Even if you're using a walking foot, whatever, it will pull this piece of fabric shorter. Even if it's a really good quality piece of fabric, it pulls your fabric shorter. There is some take up. So you're going to sew your rickrack on first before you trim your pieces. Now, what you're going to do is, this is a piece of fabric from Blend Fabrics, and this is a piece of fabric from Moda. And different companies, even though the fabric nomenclature says that something is 44, 45 inch wide, the fabric companies mill in different places, and some will have 44-inch fabric, some will have 42-inch fabric, some will have, sorry about adjusting the camera here, some will have 41. So it's not always going to be the same. So you have to lay your fabrics on top of each other, and you're going to, on one end here, make your ends even, slide it across all the way, and make your end even here. See, now look at this one's longer than this one is. So we're going to cut these all to be even. And this one here too is going to have to be laid on there. And we're going to cut them all to the exact same length. After you sew your trim on, you're going to take your ruler and your rotary cutter, and you're going to get rid of those selvages too at the same time, because when you make your seam allowances, you don't want your selvages showing out. So I'm going to trim these all to be the exact same size. Here, throw that out. Go to this end. You can use pins so that you're keeping them all together, keeping it all together, same size. Trim this off here. Okay. Now I'm going to do the same thing with this other one. Toss this aside. Put this one along here. They need to all be exactly the same length. Exactly. And even though you're cutting them all the same length, when you go to sew them all together, something's going to happen. And one's going to be slightly longer than the other. I guarantee it. I've been sewing garments for over 40 years. It always happens every single solitary time. And then there's tricks to fixing that though. And we can talk about those too. All right, so trimming that off. Now they're all the same size. Okay. So we're going to do the bottom band first. So the next thing you're going to do is sew this right sides together and go over and sew it on the sewing machine or the serger, and so that this is a continuous loop. Okay, so that this is just one continuous loop. We allowed 1/2-inch seam allowances is what I said. So we're going to sew this 1/2-inch seam allowance. We're going to sew this together, right sides together, this long bottom band with a 1/2-inch seam allowance. Keep your seam allowances consistent. Pin it. You can sew this with a together 1/2-inch seam allowance. We'll do the same exact thing with this one here. We'll get rid of that selvage within the half an inch seam allowance. Right there. That will be taken up with that. Okay. So go do that. All three of them get a 1/2-inch seam allowance. Sew them all together. Sew along here. Sew along the short edge. Sew here and then sew here. Okay, so here I've finished my edges with the serger. I've sewn this together with a 1/2-inch seam allowance. I've sewn this together with a 1/2-inch seam allowance, and this. Now I don't need to do a finish on these, and the reason for that is because I'm going to be folding this in half, and it's going to be on the inside. Same with this. I'm going to be folding it in half as the band, and it's going to be on the inside. So I don't need to worry about the seam finish with this. But this, if you don't have that finished off with a zigzag or a serger, you're going to have a mess in the washing machine every single time you wash this skirt, and it's going to work its way away to nothing. I cannot stand, sometimes I will just line things when I make garments just for the neatness of it. I can't stand to see an unfinished edge. That's why I will never, and I think they're cute, the rag quilts are really cute, I could never ever make one myself. I had 4-H instructors that would beat it into us. We did not ever leave a raw edge on anything. So I'm a compulsive liner, I'm a compulsive seam finisher, but that's just the best way to do things. So now that these seams are all sewn together, I'm going to turn this right sides out. Okay, So my band, my bottom band, that's the wide one here. Remember I said that that gets folded in half. So we're going to fold this in half, and you can go over to the iron and give that a press. So that match up those raw edges, match up those long raw edges, and then give it a press, nice and flat. Okay, so now I'm going to pin this together. But I'm going to pin it so that I'm pinning it from this side. Because when I sew it, when you sew this together, you don't want this seam, or you don't want the stitching to show out. All you want is the top little edge of that rickrack. Now, let's talk about the rickrack first. I guess we'll back up a little bit here. When I sew rickrack on, that's kind of out of focus. Let me see if I can focus this a little bit better. You sew on the, you're going to kind of sew on the edge that's closest to the end of the fabric there. You don't sew it right in the middle. Sew over to the side so that you're just along the bottom of those concave edges there, so that more of the piece that's going to be showing out, because remember what's going to happen is when you stitch it, it's going to be turned like this, and you don't want all of that rickrack to get hidden. You want as much poking out as possible. So sew it closer to this edge here, so that when I go to put my band on there, and I pin my band to my fabric, my main fabric with the rickrack, I'm going to match my seam allowances here, okay? And then we're going to pin from this side, because when we stitch, we're going to stitch on this side of the stitching, not on this side, because when we open it out, we don't want that stitching to be showing. So stitch on this side, because then the stitching on the stitches where you stitch the rickrack to the fabric will be within the seam allowance, and you won't be seeing it. So stitch just to the, or on top of it, stitch right on top of it, or right to the outside here of that. So I'm going to pin this all the way around. I'm going to match those raw edges. I'm going to be pinning like this all the way around, matching my raw edges and pinning that bottom band all the way around. Okay, so in the interest, I didn't have you watch me pin this whole thing so we could make this video as concise as possible. But I pinned the whole band all the way around so that when I open this out, and I'm done sewing it, this is how it's going to look. Isn't that sweet and adorable? That is just going to be so cute. But remember how I said, no matter how much you measure, how perfect you cut, you're always going to have a mismatch in the end. After 40 years, I still have a mismatch at the end, so do not feel bad. Look, there's a little bit gappiness. This piece here was slightly longer, even though I cut it exactly the same size. I made my seam allowances ½ inch on both of these. I still have some extra. So either this stretched a little bit or something shifted. What do you do to remedy that? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm sewing this so that this side is up, because I have to see where my stitching is for my rickrack. So I know that I need to stitch to this side of that stitching so that that's included in the seam allowance and no one sees that stitching. So I already know that this is going to be on top. But if you put this piece underneath on the bottom, when you have extra gap, you always put the piece with the extra gap on the bottom against the feed dogs. If you have a dual feed machine, that's not going to work. I have a Bernina. I do not have a dual feed machine. So always the feed dogs underneath are going to pull that bottom piece slightly more than the top piece gets fed through. It's just a fact of life. It just happens. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, as I'm sewing, I'm going to allow this to get pulled through by the feed dogs, and it is going to end up matching exactly. Trust me, it will. I've been doing this for 40 years. I'm going to show you that right now. Okay, there's a little bit of glare from the lights of the sewing machine in the camera, but you can see underneath here, you can see that gappiness, that extra bit. So I'm going to start sewing over here. I'm going to sew to the left or to the far side, away from my seam allowance, from that stitching where the rickrack was stitched on. And you see the gappiness there. See that? Okay. So what am I going to do to fix that? Well, I'm just going to kind of keep sewing and pulling it along, making it straight, at the same time as I'm keeping these two raw edges together, and I'm also sewing to the left of that. Let me see if I can get less glare there for you. To the left of that stitching. Now what you can do is you can get a non-piece of metal, like a toothpick, and you can always go like this underneath there and kind of gently push that fabric without making a gap forward so that that gappiness gets taken up. Don't make a bubble, don't make a crease or a pleat. See, already a lot of that gap is already almost gone. And as I keep sewing, it's just going to go away. See that? It totally went away. It's completely gone. If you're new at this, you should be sewing with your pins more frequently. Your pins should be closer together. Now when I get done with this, the first thing I'm going to do is finish off that raw edge. You can see already just from handling it, the little pieces of threads that are like this, that are raveling. Okay, so now I'm back after sewing that all on. I've sewn on that whole bottom band all the way around. See that? So that when I flip this out, this rickrack will be, press it, and then the rickrack will be down against the band. Super cute, right? And now I have to go and finish that edge, right? Either with a serge or zigzag. All right, so this is the bottom band. Look how cute that is. That there's no hem. You can't see a rolled up hem with stitching all the way around. So it makes basically just an invisible hem by putting a band there instead of a hem. All right, so I'm going to finish that edge with a zigzag. And then I did the same thing with the casing, identical with the casing. You're just sewing it right sides together, all the way around. I did that right sides together, all the way around with the, move this over a little bit. There we go. Right sides together, but with the casing, remember the elastic has to go through there. So you're going to have to leave an edge or a piece that is unsewn. Right there's my opening. Right there's my opening where I'm going to put my elastic through. All right. So I'm going to put my elastic through right there. There's my little opening. I'm going to take a pin and put my elastic through the casing. And I'm also going to finish this off before I put my elastic in, right? You're going to finish that edge because once the elastic's in there, you can still do it, but it's going to be really hard. So let's finish off that edge with a serged edge, but when you finish that off, that opening still has to remain open. You can't finish that spot right there because you got to keep that open to get that elastic through, right in there. Okay, so look at this now. Isn't this cute? Here is the band, lower band with the rickrack, and it is finished off beautifully with my serger. No raw edges here. Okay, so when it goes through the wash machine, it's not going to ravel. Here's the casing. Finished that all off with the serger. Kept a spot open to put my elastic through, which is right here. All right, so now we're going to get a pin and some elastic, and we're going to put that elastic through. Now this part, you know, it's tricky for new sewers. You get a pin and you put it through the elastic, you put it on the end of the elastic, and then you thread that elastic through. And I'm going to show you how to do that. Okay, so how big to make the elastic? Well, you measure the child's waist. You measure the child's waist measurement. And it used to say, the big 4 or 5 pattern companies would say, measure the waist and add 1 inch because you've got extra bulk from the fabric that's going to create an extra distance around the waist. That doesn't work. If you do that, the thing is going to be too loose. I don't like to see things falling down. Nobody likes to feel things falling down. If you ask me, slightly tight is better than too loose. So you measure the child's waist, and I just leave it at that. And then I'm only going to overlap it when I get done by maybe about a 1/2 inch. And that way it's going to be it's going to be tight enough and snug enough that it's going to fit around their waist nicely. So if the child's waist, most toddlers are about 22 inches, somewhere in there. Measure the child's waist and cut your elastic to that length. Then you put your pin through your elastic. Don't put it so close to the edge right here, because if as you're threading it through, this breaks off, you've got a loose piece of elastic in your waistband and you also have a pin sitting in there somewhere. I can tell you all these things out of experience because these are all things that I've done. So, okay, so we're going to pin this closed and thread it through my opening here. And my opening. And this elastic has to fit through here. So make sure you've got the right size elastic for the casing that you've sewn. I'm going to go this direction. Let's turn the camera a little bit like this. Okay, cord's in the way here. All right, this document camera has been really a blessing for being hands-free, but there's a learning curve. All right. Okay, so you push with your left hand, you push the fabric toward the pin. Go around that corner here with this elastic. There we go. And the elastic in the casing, there should not be a lot of extra room in that casing. If the elastic is 3/4 of an inch, this is supposed to be an inch. Not a lot of extra room because you don't want that elastic. You can get non-roll elastic, but you don't want the elastic twisting around. The one thing about non-roll elastic though is it's not very soft. And so it seems like it just, I don't know, it's not as nice, but it might be worth it to not have the rolling. So you want to have your other end of your elastic, when it gets close, kind of anchored down, because pinned maybe, because you don't want to have your whole piece going through and then you got to chase after the tail. So you're going to keep going all the way through. And when you come out, this is hard for some reason for my little 4-H girls to figure out. They have a hard time coordinating getting that elastic through, but eventually they get it. It's like threading when you lose the sweatshirt in the end of your hood into your hood, although they don't always do, they don't have the ties on sweatshirts anymore like they used to, because people are afraid of strangulation. But when you used to have those, we'd have to thread those back through if they came out of your sweatshirt. So you're working that along. You're working that along so that your elastic's going through. Take a little bit of time. So I'm going to anchor this down so that when I keep pulling this through, I don't lose the end of it. So just anchor that down with a pin. Keep going through. Make sure as you're doing this that it's not getting twisted in that casing. You want it to be flat all the way around. You don't want to twist. That's a common mistake for beginners, is that elastic gets twisted. I remember being like 10 years old and sewing summer shorts, putting the elastic in. And then later on, when I put them on, I'd find that the elastic was twisted. It's a really common mistake for beginner sewers. But better that they're sewing and making mistakes than not sewing at all. All right, so I'm to the end here. So I'm going to remove that pin so that I can pull this all the way out, because it's kind of in the way. Okay, so now I've checked to make sure that this isn't twisted anywhere in there, which it's not. It's flat. It's not twisted anywhere. Okay, it's not twisted. It's nice and flat all the way. Now these two pieces are going to come out looking like this. All right, nice and straight. They're not twisted. So I'm going to pull them out a little extra, and then I'm going to overlap them just slightly. Go to the sewing machine. This can be tricky, but go to the sewing machine and stitch across here, like maybe 2 or 3 times, so that that doesn't come apart. Okay, so I've stitched across this back and forth. And now I'm just going to stretch it, and it's going to pop right inside of that casing. There it went. It popped right inside of that casing. I want to even up my gathers all the way around. Even up my gathers. And then I'm going to go back, and where is it? So cleverly hidden. There we go. This still has to be sewn because there's still an opening. And there's an opening between the casing and the skirt too. See that? There's a hole. Oops, I'm too far up. There's a hole there. And then you can even get your finger in there. And then there's an opening right there where that elastic went through. So now I'm going to stretch the whole thing so that I have a flat area to sew. And I'm going to finish sewing that right there along that, catching all the layers, catching all those layers. And then I'm going to finish off by serging just that edge that's not serged. Right? Okay, so here it is. Look how cute. It's darling, absolutely darling. And so simple and so much fun. I bet you didn't realize something could be so easy and so much fun. So hopefully you will watch this a couple of times and you'll figure out how to make it. It's super fun and super easy. And we'll see you next time with the next video.